Ryland Grace is not supposed to be that attractive. He's awkward, he stress eats, he panics every 20 minutes, and he looks like he hasn't slept since 2019. Yet somehow, the internet looked at this exhausted science teacher floating through space and collectively said, "Yeah, that's the one." Because Project Hail Mary accidentally created one of the most powerful character archetypes on the internet: the hot nerd. And what makes it fascinating is that Ryland Grace doesn't feel attractive in the normal Hollywood way. He's not hypermasculine, not emotionally unavailable, and he's not doing the whole cool mysterious alpha male thing. This man literally survives by screaming at math and emotionally bonding with an alien rock spider. And yet, he feels more appealing than most action heroes. Why? Because Ryland Grace activates something psychological that modern audiences are starving for. Which is intelligence, emotional safety, competence under pressure, and vulnerability without ego. Which means this isn't just about Ryan Gosling being hot. Although, unfortunately, that does not help the situation. Because somehow Ryan Gosling managed to make sleep-deprived STEM teacher having a panic attack in space feel weirdly romantic. And the weird part is, it's completely psychological. Now obviously, part of this is Ryan Gosling. Putting Ryan Gosling into anything is basically cheating. You could cast this man as an exhausted IKEA employee having a nervous breakdown near the lamp section, and somehow people would still call him cinematically attractive. But Ryland Grace works because the attraction goes deeper than appearance. He activates a very specific fantasy that modern audiences are becoming obsessed with: the hot nerd archetype. Not the stereotypical actually nerd. I'm talking about the kind of intelligent person who feels safe, capable, emotionally real, and strangely comforting under pressure. Ryland Grace is attractive because he's smart without being arrogant, competent without acting invincible, emotionally vulnerable without feeling weak. And most importantly, he feels authentic. No performance, no fake cool guy energy, no Sigma male podcast aura. Ryland Grace feels human in a way most movie protagonists don't anymore. Which is exactly why audience connected to him so intensely. So what exactly is the hot nerd effect? Because this isn't new. Characters like this have been quietly taking over the internet for years. Not because they're the loudest person in the room, but because they feel genuinely compelling to watch. And psychologically, attraction is rarely just about appearance. It's about perceived value. Ryland Grace is attractive because his intelligence feels useful. Not performative, not ego-driven, and not that "I'm smarter than everyone here" type of genius. He uses intelligence to survive, and that changes everything. Because audiences are exhausted by emotionally empty male protagonists who act cool 24/7 and stare at explosions like they pay taxes there. Meanwhile, Ryland Grace is over here stress sweating through astrophysics while trying not to die. And somehow, that feels more attractive. Why? Because competence creates tension. Watching someone solve impossible problems in real time is incredibly engaging. Especially when they're still visibly human while doing it. Ryland doesn't feel like a machine, but he feels like a guy whose brain is sprinting faster than his emotional stability. And that balance matters. He's curious, emotionally expressive, awkward, funny without trying, clearly intelligent, but never threatening. That last part is important. A lot of fictional geniuses are written as emotionally cold or arrogant. Their intelligence becomes a weapon. But Ryland's intelligence feels collaborative, warm, almost teacher-like. Which makes sense because he literally is a teacher. And that creates a completely different emotional reaction from the audience. You don't watch Ryland Grace thinking, "I could never talk to this man, I'm too smart for him." You watch him saying,
"A genius engineer, and if I can't understand what he's saying, he puts on a little puppet show for me and my tiny brain, and you know what? I don't mind it."
That authenticity is the key. Ryland Grace doesn't flex intelligence, but he survives with it. And weirdly enough, that's hotter than confidence. But here's the thing. This character only works if the casting works. And Ryan Gosling is kind of the perfect storm for this type of role. Because Gosling already carries a very specific emotional energy on screen. Quiet intensity, softness, subtle loneliness, and the ability to look emotionally devastated while simply staring out of a window. Which, to be fair, is basically his superpower at this point. The reason Ryland Grace feels attractive instead of annoying is because Gosling never plays him like a stereotypical movie genius. Another actor could have made this character feel too quirky, too arrogant, or like the kind of guy who corrects your grammar during an earthquake. But Gosling adds warmth. You believe people would actually want to be around this man, even when he's spiraling. And weirdly, Ryan Gosling's attractiveness works best when he looks sleep-deprived, confused, emotionally overwhelmed, and 5 minutes away from a complete psychological collapse. Because that creates relatability. He doesn't feel untouchable. He feels human. There's this constant sense that Ryland Grace is thinking.
I put the knot in astronaut.
While simultaneously solving problems no one else on Earth could solve. And that contradiction is incredibly compelling to watch. Because confidence is attractive, but hidden competence is even more attractive. Especially when it comes wrapped in vulnerability instead of ego. And that's the key difference. Ryan Gosling doesn't play Ryland Grace like a genius, but he plays him like a man trying not to fall apart. Which somehow makes the intelligence feel more real, and the character infinitely more lovable. But I think the real reason Ryland Grace feels so attractive has nothing to do with intelligence. It's emotional safety. And modern audiences are desperately responding to that right now. Because for a long time, fictional male leads were built around emotional distance. The fantasy used to be unreachable, mysterious, dangerous, and emotionally unavailable. But Ryland Grace feels like the complete opposite of that archetype. He listens, he cares, he panics, yes, constantly, but he never stops being compassionate. And that changes the emotional atmosphere of the entire character. Ryland doesn't feel like someone performing masculinity. He feels like a genuinely decent person trying his best under impossible pressure. Which is honestly rarer in fiction than the alien space spiders. And this is where the psychology gets interesting. Because audience increasingly associate attraction with emotional intelligence. Not just confidence, not just dominance. But kindness, patience, empathy, and emotional availability. Ryland represents what a lot of people now describe as safe masculinity. A man who is intelligent without ego, competent without control issues, vulnerable without feeling weak. And the clearest example of this is his relationship with Rocky. Because the moment Project Hail Mary stops being just a survival story and becomes a friendship story, Ryland becomes 10 times more lovable. Think about how he treats Rocky. He's patient, curious, adaptable, and emotionally open. He doesn't react to the unknown with aggression. He reacts with fascination. Even their communication feels intimate.
Hi, Grace.
You're in a ball.
So Rocky no Diane Grace atmosphere. I come up.
Oh, you're coming up.
Foreign body detected.
These two are basically doing intergalactic Duolingo while risking death together. And somehow it becomes one of the most emotionally sincere relationships in modern sci-fi. Because Ryland's instinct is never domination. It's connection. That's why audiences trust him emotionally. And trust is deeply connected to attraction. People don't just watch Ryland Grace and think, he's smart. They think, I would feel safe around him. And honestly, that feeling is more powerful than traditional hotness ever was. Ryland Grace becomes attractive because people feel emotionally safe around him, even through the screen. And Ryland Grace also taps into something the internet has become weirdly obsessed with lately. Competent men. Not toxic men, and not ultra-dominant action heroes. Just people who are genuinely good at things. The internet loves watching capable people operate under pressure. Engineers fixing impossible problems, doctors staying calm during chaos, professors explaining complex ideas effortlessly, or survivalists looking disgusted while eating.
Grace looks disgust when eat.
How do you look when you eat?
It look beautiful.
Show me. Oh my God.
There's something deeply satisfying about competence. And Ryland Grace is basically the final form of that fantasy. Because he's constantly thrown into situations where failure means death, and his response is never, I'm the greatest man alive. It's usually more like,
I put the knot in astronaut.
That's what makes him compelling. Competence signals reliability, stability, and capability under stress. Psychologically, those traits are incredibly attractive because they make people feel protected. Not through aggression, but through problem solving. Watching Ryland Grace solve problems feels emotionally reassuring. Even when everything is collapsing around him, there's this underlying belief that he'll eventually figure something out. And that fantasy has become much more appealing to modern audiences than the classic dangerous bad boy archetype. Because the fantasy isn't. He's dangerous. The fantasy is.
It could work.
That's the hot nerd effect in its purest form. A man who stays useful in chaos becomes emotionally magnetic. And I think that's why Ryland Grace stays in people's heads long after the story ends. Because he doesn't feel like a fantasy designed in a laboratory. He feels painfully human. He's awkward, scared, emotionally messy, and sometimes genuinely ridiculous. This man spends half the movie one inconvenience away from a complete emotional reboot. And yet, that imperfection is exactly what makes him memorable. Because Ryland Grace represents a bigger shift happening in how audiences define male attractiveness. For a long time, fictional men were expected to feel untouchable, dominant, emotionally distant, and always in control. But characters like Ryland show that audiences are connecting more deeply with something else now. Emotional intelligence, kindness, competence, vulnerability, and authenticity. Not perfection, but humanity. Ryland doesn't feel attractive because he's trying to impress people. Ironically, he's too busy trying not to die in space. And maybe that's why he works so well. Because underneath all the science, panic attacks, and interstellar trauma, Ryland Grace feels like someone real. Someone who gets overwhelmed, someone who cares deeply, or someone who's terrified but keeps going anyway. And psychologically, that creates emotional attachment far stronger than traditional coolness ever could. Ryland Grace isn't attractive despite being awkward, emotional, and nerdy. He's attractive because of those things. Maybe that's why Ryland Grace feels so different from most protagonists. He doesn't feel engineered to look cool. He feels real, messy, exhausted, emotionally transparent. A genius, but also a man who looks like he's lost at least 12 arguments against his own anxiety. And somehow, that became hotter than perfection. Because the hot nerd effect isn't really about nerdiness, but it's about humanity. A person who is intelligent without ego, competent without arrogance, and vulnerable without pretending to be invincible. Ryland Grace reminds people that emotional connection will always be more compelling than performance, even in space. If you enjoy character psychology, emotional decoding, and the hidden reasons fictional characters affect us so deeply, follow Scene Theory for more videos like this. And honestly, we should probably all thank Ryan Gosling for making academic burnout look cinematic.